Welcome to the Pod of Inquiry, pushing the envelope for human understanding and optimization, the podcast for podiatrists. The Pod of Inquiry is designed to empower you with knowledge. What happens from there is up to you. Your host, Dr. Stephen Barrett, has designed this show to take you down some very deep rabbit holes, hopefully bringing you back out again, relatively unscathed, but cerebrally whipped, enabling a better understanding of all things worthy of inquiry. If you have more questions after the show, then that is good. The new discovery today many times was the new discovery 50 years ago, only to be suppressed or plainly ignored. Medicine and surgery can sometimes take a long while to get their paradigm shifted. We hope to have a lot of fun on this show and maybe destroy some ridiculous dogma along the journey. Thanks for joining the show today. Let's start spelunking.
Hello, fellow spelunkers. I'm happy to bring you this wonderful conversation I have had with a true scientist. Today's guest is Robert Dennis, PhD. Dr. Dennis is a mechanical engineer and has his PhD in biomedical engineering from the University of Michigan. He was recruited by NASA to work on the team in the development of the International Space Station with a focus on growing human nerve cells in a microgravity environment. Specifically, NASA's interest was to evaluate the effect of electromagnetic energy on tissue cultures. Interestingly, Dr. Dennis was initially a skeptic of PEMF, pulsed electromagnetic fields, and began his tenure with NASA with a very negative bias regarding the benefits of magnetism on cellular function. I had such an interesting conversation with Bob that we went longer than expected, and truthfully, I could have spent many more hours with him. Because of the length of our visit, I've decided to break this wonderful experience into 2 episodes. And I most likely will have Bob back for more discussions, as I really appreciate his insight and candor about medical research and scientific methodology. More concisely said, he tells you what's real and what's not in medical research. Dr. Dennis is the founder of Micropulse, a manufacturer of PEMF devices for patient use that is located in North Carolina. I personally have used his technology on myself and have prescribed many units for patients over the last year. I can't say enough about how much I enjoy Bob, how his company has been just a blessing to work with, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Robert Dennis.
Now, I was telling you earlier before we started the recording about how I had used the TMS on my knees, and I could feel like you talked about this. I described it. It was like this weird plasma was squirting between the femoral condyles and my tibial plateau.
And it doesn't feel bad, does it?
No, it was weird.
Cool.
It was weird. I was like, did I just get, taken up by aliens to another place? But because it was such a hard thing to describe.
It's very weird.
But from an analgesic standpoint, it was unbelievable. I mean, it literally shut the pain off right then and there. And I've used it in many other areas. And now I'm using your device, your M1 device. But I guess the point of that was maybe that gives us a little bit of a segue into some of the clinical applications, because, I think the number one thing at the top of everyone's mind is, okay, let's implement this type of technology for pain management. Chronic pain is huge. I don't know the statistics, but almost everyone in the United States would agree that it's certainly one of the most, if not the most, prevalent conditions, regardless of the etiology, that we have.
The statistics are 1 out of 3 adults suffers with chronic pain at some point in time in their life. And according to painmed.org, if you add up every person who is afflicted with type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, stroke, AIDS, add them all up and you double that number, that's approximately the number of people who have chronic pain.
Yeah.
It is by far more than everything else combined, the most prevalent medical condition.
Yeah.
Believe it or not.
And with the pushback on opioids, we're always looking for other ancillary methods. But so maybe we can talk a little bit about pain. And, that's certainly a big part. These patients pain. But there are also some other things that we could talk about as far as like acceleration of healing. I have an example with 3 or 4 patients now that had a droplet, and after we decompressed their common peroneal nerve, they still didn't get the function that we wanted them to have. So we stimulated their anterior and lateral compartments quite a bit. And I remember one time this fellow came back to me and he said he had been gone for like 4 or 5 months, and he showed up and he's like, "Hey, look, I've been doing what you told me with the magnets, and I've got," and post-operatively, he didn't really get that much, but there was definitely an effect on the muscle, and obviously the neuromuscular junction. Something happened there because they got their sensation back right away, but the motor function didn't return. But so let's talk about pain first, and then maybe go into some of these other applications, because I'm interested in what you have to.
Okay, well, it's probably best if I describe it from how did I go from NASA to pain?
Yeah.
Talking to anyone who's worked at NASA, they would tell you that's an easy
transition.
An easy segue, but let's just not be cynical about it. Let's just say, okay, scientifically, it was very interesting. In 1996, 1997, I worked with those guys. It was like, wow, it's making these cells really, these human neuronal cells really express genes and stuff. So, okay, I was wrong. I admit there's something to this. Boy, I'd like to look at it some more. And then NASA got kind of weird, and the guys that I was working with, I was not particularly okay with the way they conducted science after that. So we kind of parted ways. I had worked a little bit with DARPA on this because DARPA was really interested in it, but I don't want to talk about DARPA. It's interesting and valuable, but
what is DARPA? What is
Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. You've probably heard of some of the things that they created, like the internet.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it started off as ARPANET.
Okay.
Because they used to be called ARPA. It was the Advanced Research Project Agency before they put the word defense in front of everything military so that taxpayers would continue to pay for it. So that's what it is. And DARPA is really wonderful in a lot of ways. DARPA exists because of Sputnik, because we were strategically surprised by Sputnik. Like, what the heck's going on? The godless communists can fly over our heads and look down at us, and we can't do anything about it. Beep, 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 beep. They made ARPA into DARPA. They made ARPA at the time to prevent strategic surprise. So DARPA is interested in anything, anywhere that anyone's thinking about that could cause strategic surprise. And at one point, they're like, this is a really interesting thing we want to know about healing. We don't want our adversaries to have the advantage of understanding it when we don't. So anyway, I didn't have much to do with NASA after that. I was busy getting my tenure and being a professor and stuff like that. And it was interesting, but it was outside of my field. And frankly, it was pretty fringy science. I mean, you can't just go to the NIH and say, hey, I'd like to study PEMF, because they're like, hey, you're a quack.
Right.
Get out of here. Right.
Yeah, right.
So I had to establish myself as a young professor trying to get legitimate funding for legitimate research. Then I started getting phone calls from companies that were trying to license the technology from NASA that I had developed for them. And NASA said, well, you really need to talk to Bob Dennis. Long story short, a bunch of companies contacted me and said, can you build these for us? Industrial ones to process cells. I said, yeah, sure. Right. So I made these things, big plastic rings that they could put like bottles of cells into and stuff. Why is that relevant? Well, because one day I really seriously hurt my back years and years ago. And as a firefighter, actually, a really serious back injury. And I was just in such terrible pain. And I happened to have been building one of these industrial things for one of the companies that wanted to license it. And I thought, I might as well, people are saying weird things about PEMF, and I know mine works for something, might as well try it. So I just took one of these loose plastic rings that you're supposed to put bottles of cells in and rotate them, put it behind my back as I was sitting down, scouring the internet for an answer. Like, what can I do about this back pain? I don't want to be cut on. I don't want somebody to cut on me and then have failed back syndrome or anything like that,
Like
But
60% of the people.
like, number
Yeah.
I heard is more like 85, but
Yeah.
it's bad. It's a lot and it's bad. And then they're like, well, sorry, we can't help you. You
Right.
must have been non-compliant
Right.
because it
Or
doesn't
you're
work all the time.
Or you're
It's your fault.
psychotic,
Yeah, it's your
in
fault,
mind.
right?
Right.
Well, so I mean, I was fairly desperate because I had gone to the pain clinic here at UNC, and they gave me a huge bottle. It was a big one of oxycodone, and they said, "Here you go on your way." And then when I went back for more, they're like, "Well, no, we can't give you more." And I said, "Well, there's still lots of pain."
Yeah.
And so the medical note was, drug seeking behavior. I'm going to have to go. That's what was in my record. I'm going to have to go somewhere else. And I went to see an orthopedic surgeon, really good guy. I really owe him a lot. He said, he just came in the examination room, closed the door behind him, and he said, "I'm just going to tell you straight." He said, "You're inoperable. Don't let anybody cut on you ever. You're just going to have to learn to live with this pain." He said, "I could make money by cutting on you." He said, "It's not going to help you." And he literally had to close the door. He looked around. He's like, "Okay, that's the right answer." And I really owe that guy. He really told me the truth. And I went home that evening and I put this ring behind my back. It was 1 a.m. It just happened to be exactly 1 a.m. And I like searching through the internet, just kind of leaning forward, reading my computer screen. All of a sudden, pop, 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 pop. If you've ever had like a really good chiropractic adjustment,
right,
boy, it really pops. But also, if you have a bad back and it starts to pop, your first question is, "Oh, what did I just do? I'm going to be completely helpless for the next month."
Right.
And then I realized, wait a second, no pain. Like miraculously no pain, right? I was like, no way. So I sat there for another, half an hour, just enjoying not being in pain, looking at my computer. And then I'm like, hey, I'm really tired because I haven't slept for a few weeks really very well at all. So I went and had a great night's sleep. 2 or 3 days later, the pain started coming back. And I thought, oh, great. It didn't really work. Well, let me try it again. Got the same result. First time, it only took me 14 minutes. It was 1:14. I happened to notice right there on the computer. So it was like 14 minutes of PEMF, pretty powerful stuff, pretty powerful signal, but it was industrial, right?
Right.
And I was like, man, this is really good. So I just was like, okay, well, let's, I'm an engineer, so let's take lemons, and make lemonade, and then we can make, a nice lemon degreaser, and then we can, we can turn these, we can turn these lemons into a whole series of useful things, because this is a really big problem. I had just gone through the ringer through the entire medical system, which, shot me out the back end and told me I was screwed.
Right.
So I was like, all right, scientist, heal thyself. Can I replicate this? Yeah, sure. Can I make it smaller? Yeah, sure. Can I put a number on my pain reduction? No, it turns out you can't measure pain the same way you can measure blood pressure. That's why people have to give you a little smiley face, sad face, scale of 10 for pain. There's no such thing as a painometer. We don't know.
I've got to stop you there. I have had one of those on back order with my crystal ball, and
they work best when you're sitting in a pyramid.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. Totally. Right. With one eye on the top.
One eye on the top, the all-seeing eye.
Yeah.
And there's people who will tell you they can sell a painometer, but I can tell you as a medical device designer, no, that you can't. We don't know how to measure pain. That's a huge problem for veterinarians. You can't tell how much pain another organism's in.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about our pain assessments, which you look at these 1 to 10 scales, or the smiley faces, they're all garbage because they're so contextual. It's like, well, maybe the guy had a great meal just before he came in the office, and so he's thinking more about the meal than his pain. And I can't tell you how many patients I've operated on that had 10 out of 10 pain. They come back, they're happy. Oh, my pain's a 2 out of 10. And then after about 3 months, that 2 becomes their 10 again. And all of a sudden I went from a hero to, the anti-hero.
Hero to zero, right? There you go.
Yeah. So when you do get the painometer, I would love to have you
Hey,
send
you'll
me
be
an
first on my
email.
list.
I'll be the first one to buy it.
I'll send a fruit basket and a painometer to you
Right.
as soon as I get
Well,
it.
and this is something we learned, Bob. I learned it 20 plus years ago when I first started specializing in nerve surgery, is that it was a useless parameter because it had no meaning. It would vary
Right.
from day to day or hour to hour. Go ahead.
However, if you can, my back is an excellent barometer of how well these devices are working. All of a sudden, if I start feeling terrible back pain, okay, oh, the battery's out,
Right.
if and I mean, it's really quite sensitive to when it's working. I turn it on and the pain melts away in a few minutes. And if I did something wrong, if it's not plugged in, there's no placebo effect here. Because if I did something wrong, which I've done a few times, and I didn't plug the coils in properly, or I put in a dead battery, I'm like, man, it's not working. See, I should have known all along. I was just kidding myself. No, wait a second. I just need a good battery in there. Put it in, works fine, right? So, I mean, I use my own back for many years as the litmus test for, am I making a device that's going to work for chronic, incurable low back pain? That's what I was shooting for, because tons of people suffer from that, right?
Oh, yeah.
I'm not going for the moon. I just want to, okay, here's my problem. I want to fix it. And if I can fix it, I'm going to make sure it's out there for other people. That was my whole approach back, 10, 12 years ago was, yeah, we'll do that. And I just kept, reducing it in size and in power. I was able to reduce the total amount of power required by a factor of 500.
Wow.
From my
let me circle back just a little bit, because what I was going to tell you, that when we started measuring clinical metrics, how long can you stand? How far can you walk? How long can you make it through the grocery store?
Mm-hmm.
Then we would have something that we could go back on. And they would, invariably a patient would come in and they'll say, well, I'm still hurting. It's like, okay, great. How long do you have to be out at what you're doing? And, oh, I can go 2 hours now. Before it was 2 minutes.
Right. So it's ADL stuff, activities of daily living, but putting a number on it. I totally agree with you. That's very, and that's what I do with myself. It's like, okay, how long was I able to work today?
Right.
How long was I able to go for a walk before I just had to stop because of the pain or something? Yeah.
So I'm a fellow back pain sufferer. I've had herniated discs for God knows how long. Made me quit the greatest sport of ever in the invention of human sports development, which is golf. Which probably caused it to begin with. But regardless,
it's cool. I used to golf.
Yeah, regardless, you've got some great videos to instruct people on how to place the coils, and an illustration where you stack them. For low back, what do you do? Adjacent, touching one to one? Or what do you
initially thought, well, okay, I put a coil there because my initial system had one coil.
Right.
And boy, that worked pretty well. That was the first one I used. It was one bigger coil, but it was a really powerful system that was industrial, right? For processing biomolecules for cells.
Right.
Okay, put one coil there, worked really good. I thought, well, I'll put a strip of coils, along my spine. Ouch, it hurt. Made it worse. All right. And then I was like, well, okay, trying to be a little bit creative. What if it's like, in your arm or your leg or some deep tissue? I'm being a little bit of an engineer. There's a thing called a Helmholtz coil. So you have a coil here, a coil there, and the space in between them, you end up with a football shaped magnetic field.
Right.
So you only have one coil. It kind of curves around pretty quickly. Right.
Okay.
But imagine like you're trying to blow bubbles. Got a little film in there. You can connect it and stretch it out.
Right.
With two coils, you can stretch the magnetic field out and get a longer kind of a run of the magnetic field lines. So that's how I solve them now. So there's two separate coils, and you can stack them together, bumpy side to bumpy side, or you can put them on, say, opposite sides of your hand or opposite sides of your knee, because it allows you to move the magnetic field lines around, which are always going through the center of the coils, right?
Right.
Imagine you're literally aiming this magnetic field. And we know from studies in the 1960s that bone and other tissues respond to electric fields if you're willing to cut into them and put electrodes in to conductively drive DC electric currents. You can get tissues to heal up and fractures to fuse using these currents, but you had to put wires in around somebody's bones. That's not good.
Right.
But you can do it inductively, right? But the direction of the electric flow really matters. If it's going the wrong direction, it doesn't help much. So because this magnetic induction causes electric fields of known direction, you can move the magnetic fields around and get quite different response. Like if you place them from side to side on your knee, it works quite differently if you have the same distance between coils, but front to back. Totally different. You might take the coils, put them around your fingers and your finger joints. They don't seem to benefit. But if you sandwich it above and below your fingers,
Right.
Big difference. Right. Same with your toes.
Right.
Right.
So when we were looking at in the lower extremity, if we were looking at one particular area that we really wanted to focus on, I would do that. I would put one anterior, one posterior for that effect that you talk about. What was the name of that you said?
Oh, it's called a Helmholtz coil. HLMHOLZ. You can look it up on Wikipedia. They actually have a pretty good article on it.
Well, we'll put a link to Wikipedia on the show notes because people like to look up curious stuff. But
it's a pretty good. It's accurate,
right?
And it describes how Helmholtz coils work. It's like two solenoids. When you bring them on axis close to each other, it pulls in the magnetic field, so the lines are closer to parallel, not quite perfectly, but close, and it gives you essentially a much deeper tissue you could go through.
Interesting.
Right?
So for low back, would you put one on the abdomen?
I've done it. I've tried them all, and on the abdomen and lower back really seems to work well. If I could feel, actually, we were talking about how you could feel it, like a sort of an anterior spinal lesion. I could feel it like around my L3, L4. I could feel it. And I did that for like a year, and that seems to have taken care of that. And now most of my problems seem to be more, more ventral, kind of dorsal, I guess, or ventral posterior. And so I just put them like on the surface of my lower back. If you put the coils side by side, the magnetic fields are going to go like this across your spine, right? And that seems to work pretty well. And so sometimes I do that. And then sometimes, like right this minute, I'll have them stacked up so that the field penetrates in and curves around, comes back out, penetrates in, curves around, comes back out. And I actually think it's important. People always ask me, what's the best? And the answer is two things. Different people and different injuries are different, especially the type of the nature of the injury. And so the way you need to stimulate the tissue is going to be a little different. So you need to do a little bit of experiment. Usually people get it on a third or fourth try. They're going, that works a lot better, right? Like if you try your knee front to back, it's not really helping so much. You might try medial, lateral, and then you go, oh, wow, that really helps a lot. And that's usually how it goes. Second, third, fourth try, you hit it just by following some basic, guidelines. But I think that's one thing that's true. The other thing that's true is habituation. And I think it's helpful to change things up.
Right.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but before you continue with this great conversation, we need to take a quick break to acknowledge this week's sponsor.
This episode is sponsored by Savant Sellers, providers of boutique Tier 1 Reds at a Tier 2 price point. Let's imagine you are spelunking in a cave out in Napa Valley, and you come across some of the juice from Savant Sellers. You may just never want to come out until it's gone. Savant Sellers sources all of their fruit from the really big-name boutique vineyards. That's right, where the elites get their fruit. If we put a vineyard designation on our bottles, we would be contractually forced to sell our wines at 3 to 4 times our current pricing. Yes, full disclosure, I am one of the 3 principals, and I'm very proud of our wines. Savant Cellars is the genius of wine. Simply great wines, vintage after vintage, crafted in a Bordeaux style so you can lay them down for years or drink them now. They simply just get better. Use the code SPELUNK15 to get a 15% discount at SavantCellars.com. That is CEVANT sellers.com. Spelunk15.
So that leads into my next question then, because I was going to talk about how do we administer these to our patients and to ourselves for that matter? Like what, when I say frequency, I'm not referring to hertz. Now I'm referring to how many times a day, how long,
right. Okay,
right?
sure.
So just give me some insight on that.
So my opinion on this, based upon feedback from a couple of thousand people so far, I've probably gotten direct feedback from 2,500, maybe 3,000 people, something like that, directly over the 10 years. Indirectly, more than that. My own personal experience, especially my own personal experience, because I keep really close attention to it. But I've also done studies with people, not formal like academic studies, but more like, okay, here's 10 people who want to work with me. Let's all try something, right?
Right.
Done a few of those. I've done some studies with, nursing schools and nurses who deal with, chronic pain and all the problems of life that come with that, right?
Right.
Like drug abuse is a really big consequence of chronic pain.
Oh yeah.
So how do I think that it should be used? All right. Disclaimer. I sell PEMF.
Right.
I make money at it. I therefore have a bias. My bias, I believe, is based upon a scientific engineering analysis of what I think works best. But it's my opinion. My opinion is that you can use very little energy and get the effect that you want if you use it for longer periods. So what I've been designing is what I call personal PEMF, something that you can own because it's affordable, something that you can wear because it's ultra portable, because it is my opinion. And I've talked to over probably 500 different clinicians who mostly agree with me on this, is that lower intensity, longer duration is better, because you want to think of PEMF as, while you're applying PEMF and for some period of a few hours afterward, you get reduced inflammation. And during that window, you get normal healing. It will feel to a 50-year-old like it's greatly accelerated healing because you're healing like you were when you were young.
Right.
Therefore, it feels magical, but it's not. It's just normal, because as you get older, your inflammatory response more and more seems to get in the way of normal healing. So we don't heal as well now as we did 30, 40 years ago, right?
Right.
So lower intensity, longer duration, daily use of small portable PEMF. You can use it while you're sleeping, you can use it while you're sitting, you can use it while you're walking or working. Lots of people use it on a work site, like construction workers tell me, yeah, this is great, man. One guy said, I ran over the thing with my 4x4 and it still works fine. It's got some scratches, but it's built for that kind of stuff, right? So one of our simpler units, you run over it. It was dirty. He had to clean it off. He's like, can I get it wet? If I want to scrub it off with a toothbrush, I was like, yeah, please don't. But my advice is to do exactly that. He wore it all day when he was working. He said, I can get home, I'm not sore all the time.
Right.
Same thing with me. I can work all day and not be sore all the time, So I find, and most people find, if they try it, they give it a fair shot, that PEMF works really well if you're applying very low intensity for a long period of time. A lot of people ask me, well, can I just do it for half as long, twice as intense? And I'm like, well, there's a reason that you can bake a cake, for example, half an hour at 350 degrees, but you can't do it for like a minute at 10,000 degrees, right? I mean, certain processes just take time. And I think the healing process during attenuated, mitigated pathologic inflammation takes time. The longer time you give it, the more that process will become dominant. So as a clinician, I think the way to think of it is, how do you tip the scale towards benefit of the client, the person, right?
Right.
So that most of the time they're healing, rather than most of the time they're in a refractory inflammatory state.
Right.
Well, the way you do that is by applying low intensity, long duration, daily PEMF. Now, the problem is when I tell clinicians that, they don't like it because it doesn't fit a clinical model where, hey, look, I just paid $45,000 for a big PEMF machine and I need to march people through my clinic. I can at the most give them 15 or 20 minutes. I need to know how to get the most out of that. And you're talking to the wrong guy, because I'm not trying to make money on PEMF. I'm not trying to help you or anybody else make money on PEMF. I'm trying to get everybody to benefit from PEMF.
Right.
And the benefit comes from, how you use it. And a lot of these protocols, these clinical protocols, are built around what we can do in our clinic hours. And now I'm not a clinician, but I mean, clinical hours of people who are using it, not built around what's best for the patient. It would be like telling a patient, come in here twice a week and I'll give you a meal, and just eat your meals here. Don't eat at home. Right. I mean, it's kind of silly, right? So, and we know that's not the right way to do things, but people do it anyway. So very few people want to hear this. And on the other end of the equation, people who are using it, they don't want to have to wear it around all day, because people are like, I just want to stop hurting. I want to get better. And then I don't want to think about it. And I'm like, well, I really can't help you.
Right.
Because this is something you need to do.
Right. Well, and I think, there are some very motivated patients, and then there are some patients that unfortunately they just want the magic pill and they don't want to do any work. So, it's incumbent upon the practitioner to figure out how to implement some of these things. There's no reason to have somebody order a device if they're not going to use it.
I agree with you.
It's a total waste of their time and money. But I think it comes down to education as well, too. It's like, if we're able to spend a few minutes with our patients and explain that, it's like, all right, listen, this is kind of the parameters that we need. And this is, how we want you to do it. It takes it out of that, okay, I've got the $45,000 machine. I got to have everybody in a 15-minute slot to pay for it. I mean, that's one of the beauties about your company, is because when I discovered your company almost a year ago, I was so blown away by not only the technology, but the affordability, because PEMF really can be very, very expensive. I mean, I've had some patients that have had strokes, and they've been, prescribed PEMF mattresses or mattress covers. And I think they paid $5-7 grand for those things. Very expensive.
Can I make a few comments? First of all,
Sure.
They're paying $5 or $7 grand now because of to a certain extent, what I believe is my greatest contribution to humanity, which is that 15 years ago, that would have been $20,000 to $50,000.
Right.
Then I entered the market and I started pricing PEMF. And I've had a few people tell me that it really forced them to reprice their systems. So some of these bigger, expensive systems, we almost have been able to take a zero off the cost of PEMF. I'm just delighted by that, because everybody knows that I am just telling the truth about it. And if you take some of these systems that they're selling for $5,000 and $10,000 and $15,000, they're based on very old technologies. There's nothing to them. You look at the inside, there's nothing special about them. We could have a whole discussion about this. I can tell you, as an engineer, I have detailed knowledge of these things, reversed engineered them, and you are paying for hype. You're not generally paying. In some cases, let me stand back. In some cases, these devices are big. They got a lot of hardware, a lot of copper. You're paying mostly for hardware there. But still, $50,000, I mean, that's like buying a car, right? Or really
About
nice.
half a car now.
Now it's a half a car, right? If you can find one.
Exactly.
So
that's without the chip.
Right. You have to buy the chips, is optional. It's like a steering wheel.
Yeah, exactly.
So a couple of things I wanted to say were, I'm not against big clinical machines, because when I talk to clinicians, they actually find the best outcome is when you do both. If a person comes in like for acute kind of treatment with a larger system, and then it makes sense to really let them have it once or twice or 3 times a week powerfully. But then if you combine that with something that they can bring home and use as much as they're able to, they get the best clinical outcome. Right. So that's actually a lot of people do that. And when I surveyed 421 clinicians who use PEMF, the majority who had tried that, the vast majority who had tried that actually agreed that, yeah, that's better outcome if you combine the two. So PEMF's a great adjunct to itself, like small, low power, personal, portable, long duration PEMF exposure.
Mm-hmm.
Goes along with this short term, high intensity very, very well. They mesh. It's almost like two separate synergistic treatments.
Well, what
right?
about with your technology? You said more of a lower intensity, longer period or duration of treatment.
Right.
What about interspersing more of, taking some of yours up to a higher level and intersperse between the longer?
Mine doesn't go up to the kinds of intensity levels. Micropulse, the brand, doesn't go up to the kinds of intensity levels to really simulate super high intensity, like a $35,000 or $50,000 clinical system.
Right.
Or even a TMS machine.
Mm-hmm.
It's not putting out that kind of power because it's not designed to. But then again, you don't have to wheel mine around on a cart. It doesn't make the lights go dim when you plug it in and turn it on. Mine will run on a 9-volt battery or a camcorder battery for hours.
But even with your lower intensities, is there any merit or value to maybe changing it up a little bit? Because you talked about habituation.
Right. Well, what I do is, like with an acute injury, like the other day, I kind of fell over a cinder block on my shin and I had quite a laceration. And I immediately started by the way, the sooner you start PEMF for an injury like that, the better. A friend of mine fell off a tractor 2 days ago on his farm. And I said, start right. He happened to have one of my systems. And I said, start right now, right this minute. He's benefiting from having done that.
Right.
So I immediately started at full power, acutely. And then I followed it up with like all night at a low intensity. Next day, I had no pain, a little bit of skin abrasion I could see. Did the same thing the next day, high power for about half an hour, maximum power for about half an hour. So what you're saying, I think, is a pretty good strategy, especially for acute injuries initially.
Mm-hmm.
Blast them for half an hour, something like that, full power, and then sort of wear the device around at lower power. And for habituation on like some of my units, you can change the pulse pattern, right? And the pulse pattern is, there's kind of a good story to that. Like, why did I pick the pulse patterns that I picked? And they're based upon fetal, like in utero, neuromuscular development. Okay. And so like what pulse patterns are our tissues, especially our orthopedic tissues, nerve, neuromotor tissues, nerve, muscle, bone, tendon, ligament, articular cartilage. What pulse patterns are those? And I'm not saying anything magical here, but we have evolved, along this kind of developmental line. You can see in an embryo that when the neuromotor system starts to develop, embryos start to twitch, right, at a certain point. And if you suppress that, then you do not get neuromotor development, and it really messes the organism up. So the system that I have developed, the basic one that I make, the A9, is based on neuromotor development, because I think there's a chance that particular pattern is a recognition of like basically slow twitch and fast twitch neuromotor patterns are recognized as pro-development, pro-growth. And I could be wrong. I could be totally wrong about that. However, I find that particular pulse pattern, most people find it most helpful to elicit a pro-growth healing response.
So I see that, well, based on what we've just talked about, I have not integrated this as much in the postoperative course for these patients, but I think that's something I'm going to start doing. And there's no detriment whatsoever.
I've talked to orthopedic surgeons about it, and they're like, "Oh no, you have to have this big inflammatory phase to stimulate." And it's even in the textbook that I'm using for the course that I'm teaching at the university, biomaterials. You have this inflammatory phase that stimulates orthopedic tissues to go into tissue repair. I challenge every surgeon who tells me that. I'm like, cool. Which paper? Where was that proven?
Right.
They're unable to prove that. I think that's a wives' tale that's been handed down because they see that as the pattern. Post-surgically, you get this inflammatory response and then healing begins. But I think it begins when your body gets some control over the inflammation. And actually, when we test it on animals or on humans, immediately post-surgically, it just accelerates healing by a factor of 2 to 3.
Mm.
So,
and I think it's kind of closed-minded to say, we tend to go down these biochemical pathways. Oh, this is the inflammatory pathway, and there's 1,000 other things that are interrelating with that particular pathway, but it's nice and tidy. So we can talk about, okay, if we give this drug, it's going to, COX-2 inhibitor is going to, hit this part of the arachidonic chain and whatnot. But everything else is going on with it too. So if you're increasing cellular function, albeit you may have an anti-inflammatory component, and this is just speculation off the top of my head, but sometimes things aren't as nice and tidy as they try to teach you in biochemistry.
There's some additional something going on, and it's like, when I talk to medical doctors and surgeons in particular, sometimes, because I used to share a laboratory with plastic surgeons at University of Michigan. There was a bunch of them. Half the people in my lab were surgeons, and they would say, well, they would never use anything on a human unless we really understood the mechanism. And then I always ask them, oh, okay, well, what's the mechanism of anesthesia?
Right.
And they're happy to tell you, oh, well, this, has this receptor and this. And I'm like, nope, that's not how it is. If you get an analog for that receptor, it doesn't work the same way. Right. And I mean, I can prove to you by logic that we can't possibly understand the mechanism of anesthesia because of the definition of what anesthesia does. It alters our consciousness and memory of pain. And we do not know what consciousness is. And we do not know really what memory is in terms of biophysically. We don't. People say, oh, yeah, neurons, synapses. No, it's not. We've proven this many times, right? So if we don't understand memory, we don't understand consciousness, we don't understand pain, which is the other thing we were just talking about. We can't measure it. How can we even begin to say, oh, well, we understand the mechanism of anesthetics? Anesthesia is one of the great medical mysteries, but people, they reassure themselves by drawing diagrams of chemicals and receptors and different things. And they get this belief that they understand something that, as you say, there's so much more going on that we just don't understand. Right. And it's not that it's not understand. We just don't understand it yet. And I'm sure that it'll be elucidated with time. Right. But I think same thing about inflammation. I mean, look, if suppressing inflammation gently made all things good, cured all ills, then all we would need is aspirin. Well, we wouldn't need PEMF, right? But as you're about to say, well, there's a lot more to it than that, right? And there is.
I was going to say, when I was a resident, there was an academic debate about whether we should use a short-acting corticosteroid immediately when we were completing the surgery. And I remember this one clinician, he would always do bilateral cases. And so I convinced him, I said, well, let's just put the steroid in the left foot. And then you tell me how they do post-operatively, whether they complain of more pain in the right or the left. And he came back a couple of weeks later and he said, listen, I never would have believed this had I not seen it. But these people are saying their left foot doesn't hurt near as much as their right. And that's the one we put the steroid in. And the pushback on it was, well, if you use a steroid, you're going to theoretically slow down wound healing. We never saw that. Okay. Right. We never saw that. I mean, and so we know that chronic pain or even acute intense pain has great effects on the immune system. And, so maybe, and I don't know, I mean, this is just interesting stuff. Maybe we'll have to sit down, you have a beer and I'll have a glass of wine, but we'll noodle it a little bit more, because it's too complex and it's too interrelated to divide it up into these nice and tidy things. It's like, oh, it's this thing or it's this thing. It's like, we're not that smart.
I totally agree with you. And as a scientist, as a sort of mechanism kind of guy, I will tell you that I think the best information on these comes from honest, detailed clinical observations.
Right.
Well, we don't know why it works that way, but boy,
Yeah.
howdy, it's working that way. That's what we see if we bother to look at it. And one thing that a lot of my surgeon colleagues at Michigan would do would be they just wouldn't look at things if they didn't want to see the answer. And people do that in general. They don't want to look at something that will upset their belief system about the universe, whatever that might happen to be.
Right.
And I think that's a wonderful experiment that you did there. I would add to it and say there's multiple mechanisms for altering, interrupting the inflammatory, it's complicated. Saying inflammation, well, that's a big catch-all, right?
Right.
And so I think that inflammation has many aspects to it that are not at all appreciated. Otherwise, like I say, I wouldn't need to make PEMF. I would just take aspirin.
Right.
I get the same kind of effect, but I don't at all.
Right.
And aspirin helps a little bit, but not a lot. PEMF helps a lot. I mean, taking the strongest pain medications I could take at the time, my pain would go from an 11 on a 1 to 10 scale. If you believe in watch Spinal Tap, I was right at a solid 11, like completely intolerable pain, to about a 6 or a 7. PEMF daily at a low intensity brings my pain from, I don't know, I haven't experienced a 10 or 11 since I started using it, down to a 1 or a 0. Like right now I'm feeling 0, right? If I don't use PEMF for a few days, it's back to a 3 or 2 or 3. Now, here's the thing about PEMF that I think is the most amazing. One of them, God, I keep saying this, right? Hyperbole, but there's so much about it that's interesting to me. And I can say that really genuinely because I started off as such a skeptic. I was like, man, you guys are wasting your time on this witchcraft nonsense. And then, boy, was I wrong, right? You do the science, it's like, actually, Bob, you're totally wrong. Okay. But which is cool. As a scientist, you want to be wrong because you structure an experiment so that no matter what the outcome is, as long as you get good data, you learn something from it. Like, gee whiz, I was right. No surprise. That's how 90% of experiments go. Yeah, we anticipated that. But more than 90%, but you occasionally get an experiment that does completely what theory and experience do not predict. Right. Then you go, wow, that's really great. Can I repeat it? Right. And you and I talked a little bit about the ability to repeat.
Right.
Is actually the fundamental thing about science. You have to be able to repeat it, or,
right.
It doesn't. But anyway, the thing that I find most interesting about PEMF is that if you use it and you continue to use it when you become asymptomatic, like for back pain, idiopathic, like foot pain, microfractures, whatever they call them, to try to describe them to people, about 80% of the time, it goes away and doesn't come back. I was not so lucky with my back. About 20% of the time, you just have an injury that just doesn't completely recover, but it mostly recovers. And the dosage that I require is less and less as the years go on. And it makes my pain go to 0, drug-free. Right. And, isn't that amazing? And that 80% of the time. And the thing is, the scientific research bears that out. They've done experiments on like rabbit ears and hematomas and stuff like that. And they actually it'll reduce the swelling and the hematoma for a few hours and everything. But if they apply it a few times, it can then stop applying it. It can last the lifetime of the rabbit. Right. It can whereas no treatment does not. Right. So there's some, although they generally speaking don't follow it out long enough to get that result, there's some good indication in peer-reviewed literature that PEMF, and I'm afraid to use this word because it's federally regulated, but I'm going to go ahead and use it with all the caveats that you got to, I'm just as one guy's opinion. PEMF cures things.
Not supposed to say that word.
It does. It cures things a lot of the time.
Right.
I was not so lucky with my lower back, but there are people who had inoperable, you know, intractable pain that use PEMF for a certain period of time. And the trick is you got to keep using it after you become asymptomatic, sort of like antibiotics. You got to do the full cycle, right? And it seems like the period of time is 2 or 3 weeks, like what it would take for tissue to really recover, right? When you're asymptomatic. And about 80% of the time, people are just done with it. They just don't have to come back to it, which to me is astonishing. And I hear this over and over and over again. So do I believe it? Well, yeah, I've heard it enough times from enough different people, unsolicited, that I believe that's probably true.
Oh,
right?
there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever from my personal experiences with it, all of the research that we had done, on TMS. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of laboratory science, like you point out, that there is definitely an effect. As with everything, I think you need to, implement it reasonably, judiciously, not from a side effect standpoint, because I haven't really seen anything, but as you know, I don't think PEMF is the magic pill that will eradicate everything, but I think it's a huge tool. And like you say, we don't have to use opioids and these types of pharmacologic agents. So that's a big advantage.
Yeah.
So
I
go ahead.
Can I make a comment on what you just said? A couple of things I think are important. I have read the entire scientific literature on PEMF that's accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had some papers translated from Russian, actually. And there is yet to be a believable or even any serious statement of a prolonged side effect. Some people hear a little ringing in their ears or something, it goes away. So as far as side effects go, I don't think there's any evidence in the peer-reviewed or clinical case study literature to suggest that there is a side effect. However, there is one side effect I can tell you, and that is that when a person who's fairly desperate is at the end of their rope and they buy overpriced PEMF, it causes impoverishment. And there are several people who've told me they can no longer afford certain things because of the amount of money they paid. And this is true for a lot of overpriced things. But I mean, if you're just like a regular person, you're dishing out $20,000-$30,000 for a PEMF system, gosh, I hope it really helps you. There's a few people who I've talked to who are like, yeah, I'm just wiped out. Right. I mean, can you imagine? But yeah, it is. It wipes people out. So I would say the worst side effect of PEMF is what happens to you financially when you pay too much for it. My opinion. I'm trying to fix that. But to segue into what you were about to say, I think PEMF is like the ultimate adjunct. It seems to help everything that you do, whether it's surgery, stem cell therapy, low-level light therapy, nutritional. I've had like 3 different nutritionists just totally out of nowhere tell me that, like NDs and nutritionists,
right,
and naturopathic doctors and or nutritionists tell me, when I started using PEMF, the other things I was doing started working the way they were supposed to.
Right.
Especially with older people. Right. So as an adjunct, PEMF helps just dial down that pathologic background inflammation, and things work better. So you heal a little better or a lot better, but other things work better too. And that's why I think, the 2 things, the take-home messages about PEMF are, aside from the fact that it needs to be affordable and reasonable, is that, use it early and often and as an adjunct.
Right.
3 things, I guess. And it seems to really be tremendously helpful. And, I'd like to hear it if a person tries reasonably and they don't see that. There have been 1 or 2 clinicians that I've talked to who actually tell me, yeah, I don't really see much of a synergistic effect, but that's 1 or 2 out of a large number. So,
well, I think you're going to see that. I mean, I've seen other types of modalities that work great in 98% of the folks, and it doesn't work in 2%. That doesn't mean you throw it all out. It just maybe your selection criteria wasn't good to begin with, or there were myriad other things going on. All right. So first of all, I want to thank you for for taking the time today. And I think I'm going to ask you right now, put you on the spot. I got to have you back because there was some things that I wanted to talk to you, like the Flexner report, how to analyze some science.
Sure.
But I'm going to do that in another episode. So I'll get back.
We could have
you.
a grumpy science episode if you want.
I want to.
All the things that really irritate you.
Yeah, I want to be on the grumpy thing. Now that I'm getting older,
wow,
I want to be grumpy.
Wow.
But so tell the folks how they can contact Micropulse. And I know you've been very kind to extend a discount offer to them. I'll have that on the show notes so that they can get started with this. My recommendation would be that you as a practitioner started on yourself, because I know if you're, probably older than 35, you have a sore spot on your body somewhere. And then you'll have the belief, because you'll have that N of one scientific experiment that you can relate to your patients and say, yeah, I use this on myself and I think this would help you. So tell me, Bob, how they can get a hold of you and your products.
Well, they can reach us by emailing to support@micropulse.com, which is my core company. Or we have a friend, it's a family business. It's me and my wife and my kids work on it. Everything you buy was assembled and tested by me. It was designed by me. So, everybody's, big push for people are like, you got to scale this up. And, I could make them by the millions, right? But if I did, I'd have other kinds of problems, regulatory and otherwise. So I kind of keep it to the small group of people who hear about it by word of mouth, because there's not one dime of cost associated with marketing built into our product. So it's like, you buy a food that's like, I don't know, BPA free or some, MSG free or whatever you don't like. Our products are marketing cost free. There's no margin built in, which is why nobody wants to market them, which is good, I guess. But you can get a hold of us at micropulse.com. Either me or my wife will answer you. And if you want to talk to me, you can always talk to me. And the best way to contact us, though, is through our forum, which I'll give you the link, but it's a forum it's the forum at fluxhealth.co. So if you go to Flux Health, FLUXHEALTH.co, and click on the forum, join our forum. And the reason I ask people to do that is that 95% of the time people ask me the same questions over and over and over again, which is fine. I don't mind answering them.
Right.
Because these are legitimate questions. And some of them are just based on really bad PEMF marketing. So your mind is a little bit polluted.
Right.
People ask me questions based on, trying to compare what I say to what another marketer says. And actually, I'm just going to tell you the scientific truth of what we do know and don't know. And you're just going to have to
sort it out.
Square the circle with a marketer and tell them,
right.
Either you believe him and you're going to pay what they want, or you believe me and you're not going to pay what they want, or you're rich enough to do both. I don't know. Right. But if you go to the forum, then when you ask the question, you can get the advice of many other people who use these devices all the time, several of whom are clinicians, and they use them all the time. And they, in fact, Steve, I invite you to just join our forum. And from time to time, if you have a question, you could go on there yourself. And any clinician who wants to, you can direct message me on the forum. I check it once or twice a day. It never takes more than maybe at the most 3 days for me to answer. But usually I answer within an hour or two. It's almost like email.
Mm-hmm.
But the benefit is if you ask a question on the forum, I will always answer it in a way that everybody can see it. And then if you have like a confidential question, we can always talk about it, offline. But most people end up not having confidential questions. They just want to know a general answer. So I'll give a general, very scientifically conservative answer to you, which will irritate you because it won't tell you exactly what you want to know, because scientifically, we actually don't know all the answers and the things that we all want to know. What's the mechanism? Why does it work? We actually don't know that. So you can ask me that. You can any way you want to, and I'll just keep saying, well, I think it's this and that. Here's some theories about it. But in reality, we don't know. But there's a few things about PEMF we absolutely do know. I've done, science and published it, peer review. Other people have. And there's some things we know for sure. But if you ask me on the forum, then you're helping
Right.
Thousands of other
Communication
people.
with other folks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bob,
Right.
thanks so much for taking the time. I think PEMF is a great modality. I've been on that train for a while, and your expertise is
Well, all I ask
very
from
appreciated.
other people, what I'd like an outcome for PEMF to be, since you because of the way you phrased it brought to my mind one last point I want to make.
Sure.
Our goal collectively should be that our grandchildren have access to this.
Agree.
Reasonably priced, good quality PEMF. It should be something that's in everybody's first aid kit. And that's my goal, is that my children, my grandchildren will be able to, your grandchildren will be able to say, oh, this is a perfect time to use PEMF right now. Boom.
Agree.
So
Bob,
that's my goal.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate you. And I'll get in touch with you after. So thanks, and look forward to talking to you again. And we'll maybe just dive into the bad science world, because I think that'd be kind of interesting as well.
Well, don't.
But I'm not even going to get you started there. But
don't get me started. Don't get me started.
Yeah.
I'll start to turn red already. Look. But yeah, we'll do it like maybe later in the day when I'm a little more cranky or something. But yeah, that'll work for me. You're in Atlanta, right?
Yeah, north of Atlanta, but we're on the same time zone. Next time I'll make it during wine o'clock.
Wine o'clock. There you go.
Yeah.
I have a beer, and we will sit around and as intelligently as possible complain about the system, because the system has got really, really great strengths. But man, as taxpayers, we all need to be able to see what the problems are, and vote them out.
Yeah, exactly. I'll probably get censored on that one, but whatever. So anyhow.
You know what? I know how to. There's things we can say.
Right. You'll have to coach. You'll have to coach me before that one.
I'll just, because we got to quit now. We've been going for a long time. But the thing is that the usual suspects, it's not because of the FDA. It really isn't.
Right.
There's other problems that are really not so easily censorable. It's not like we point at and make typical complaints about the CDC or the FDA. They've created some undesirable, unintended consequences. It's reasonable to talk about that, and we can, keep things in reasonable bounds. But I'd be perfectly happy to discuss those sort of things with you. And also, if you have, or your patients have any other questions as they arise on PEMF, I'm very happy to come on and talk to you.
Sounds great. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
We hope you all enjoyed today's show and got some truly empowering knowledge out of it. You can always follow up on anything we talked about in the show notes, found at our website, podofinquiry.com. If this incredible and educational conversation has tickled just a little bit of your cortex, please leave us a review and spread the message to your friends and colleagues. Let's keep spelunking.
This podcast is designed for informational purposes only and does not constitute any medical or surgical consulting advice or imply a development of any physician-patient relationship. The opinions of guests who are featured on the show are not necessarily the opinions of Dr. Barrett or the production team. This podcast is owned solely by Barrett Medical and Surgical Media, LLC. While the show is highly oriented for physicians and healthcare providers, anyone interested in the improvement of human performance and understanding will find this a welcome goblet to sip from, or guzzle. However, no representation or warranties are made in any way whatsoever on this podcast for any products, techniques, or other things discussed. Invited guests are not vetted by the Pod of Inquiry for their qualifications and may have a direct or indirect financial interest in what they present and discuss on the show. The Pod of Inquiry disclaims any responsibility from anything taken from the show and used personally or professionally. It is a responsibility of the listener to perform their own due diligence prior to the implementation of any ideas, products, techniques, or anything talked about on the show.